Good Erev Shabbos Parshas Beha'alosecha. The end of this Sedra, the Torah describes Moshe Rabbeinu, V'ha'ish Moshe Anav. Moshe Rabbeinu, the man, was very, very humble. Anav me'od. Mikol ha'adam asher al pnei adama, more than any other human being. And there are many parts of this pasuk that demand some comment. And I would like to amalgamate them all together, and without asking all the individual questions, just sum up a few of the comments of our Mefarshim. Number one is that Moshe is emphasized over and over again in this pasuk in multiple ways that he was a humble man, and this is reflected in an interesting gematria. It says Va'ish Moshe Anav Ayin Nun Vav. Anav is the gematria of 248. And according to Chazal, there are 248 organs in the body, and this represents the fact that not a bone in Moshe's body held the character, held the trait of pride, but rather down to the very bone, every organ, every bone in his body, Moshe Rabbeinu was indeed an humble man. This is reflected and emphasized multiple times in the pasuk. It says, "V'ha'ish Moshe," the man Moshe, anav me'od mikol ha'adam, from all human beings, emphasizing that Moshe's humility, his extraordinary humility, was not a function of the fact that he was somehow an ethereal being, he was somehow an angel, not human, supernatural. No, Moshe Rabbeinu was indeed a human being, and despite his limitation of being a human being, he was able to overcome and become the extraordinary humble individual that he ultimately became. The Mefarshim point out, the Ksav Kabbalah says, citing Chazal, that Moshe Rabbeinu indeed had a natural inclination for the more petty aspects of what it means to be a person. But Moshe Rabbeinu worked on himself, and Moshe Rabbeinu sustained his spiritual journey of refinement, and he ultimately became Moshe Anav Mikol Adam. He wasn't born this way. This wasn't who he was. This was the end game. This was the conclusion of the marathon, not the beginning, not the opening of the race. And this is an interesting point that the Rav Hutner points out in one of his letters, in his collected letters to one of his students. When the student is describing his sense of frustration and despair of not being on the appropriate spiritual standing that he expected of himself. And Rav Hutner in the letter says to him, "You're expecting too much because you are comparing yourself to your teachers, to your Rabbi, to your spiritual mentors who are finished products or close to finished products, on the closer to the end of the finished product. But you do not know where they were when they started. Can you imagine, says Rav Hutner to his student, the Chafetz Chaim? The Chafetz Chaim is known as a person who never spoke a word of Lashon Hara. But how many times did the Chafetz Chaim fail in his journey before he became the famed Chafetz Chaim? How many times was he nichshal? Did he stumble before he ultimately attained that refinement? So this is the same regarding Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was a human being with failures and faults and weaknesses. And despite that, Ish, Adam, Al Kol Pnei Hadama, on the face of the earth, which is also a metaphor for smallness and limitation and downtroddenness. From the lowest places, Moshe built himself up to become who he was, and so, therefore, can we. I think, however, it is interesting to note that a careful read of the pasuk does not say that Moshe Rabbeinu was more humble than any other person. It says, "Va'ish Moshe Anav Me'od," he was quite humble. Mikol ha'adam. Mikol ha'adam does not mean from all people. It means from the entire person. Kol ha'adam means the entire person. Kol Adam means all people, or all humanity. Now, on a pshat level, this could very well mean the same thing. Mikol ha'adam asher, from all of humanity, of the human being that walks the face of the earth. But there is something here which is a little bit of a strange configuration of the wording, which demands some explanation. And I think that one could explain it as follows, based on an idea I once heard from Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. There is a statement of Chazal that tells us that we should be dan es kol ha'adam l'chav zchus. We should judge every person favorably. However, there too, in the words of our rabbis, it doesn't say you should judge every person, kol adam, it says kol ha'adam, which means the entire person. Says Rabbi Telushkin, we should judge every person favorably by looking at the entire person, looking at their entire context, looking at their life, looking at their travails, looking at their attempts, looking at them in context. And when we look at the whole person, rather than judging them just on this moment in time, on this moment of failure, or maybe even this moment in which we misunderstand their intentions, then we will judge them favorably. Havedan is kol ha'adam, when you judge the entire person, l'chav zchus, then more likely than not, we will be able to find some measure of defense and some measure of merit to judge them in a positive light. And I would apply the same thing here as well, where the Torah says, Va'ish Moshe anav, Moshe Rabbeinu was humble, mikol ha'adam, from the entire, compared to the entire person. In other words, if we judge ourselves, if we evaluate ourselves, and compare ourselves to another human being, to another person, based on my strengths and their weaknesses, it could lead to a sense of pride. But everybody has strengths and everyone has weaknesses. And if we look at the entire person and compare ourselves and evaluate ourselves and measure ourselves next to another person who also has strengths, and their strengths might be my weaknesses, when we do that, it is more likely than not that we can attain a trait of humility and ingrained humility within ourselves. But when we only look at our strong points and our neighbor's weak points, that is certainly the pathway to gaiva, to the pathway to pride. V'ha'ish Moshe. Moshe was a simple, plain human being, not an angel. Anav, 248. Every bone in his body, every fiber in his body was soaked with this midah of humility, and pride was so far removed from him. Ma'od, quite verily. Mikol ha'adam, more than any other person that has walked on the face of the earth, meaning Mikol ha'adam, more than against the entire person. And when we evaluate ourselves against the entire person, yes, Moshe was extraordinary, but other people also have extraordinary facets. Moshe Rabbeinu was, for example, a terrible speaker. He had a speech impediment. If he would judge himself, if he would compare himself to another person who could speak well, recognizing that he is extraordinary in another area, that was Moshe's pathway to success in inculcating the midah of anivus, of humility. And Moshe could do it with his limitations and rise to the level of success that he did. Then we too are also human beings. And while maybe we cannot be Moshe Rabbeinu the way Moshe Rabbeinu was extraordinary, we can be extraordinary the way we can be extraordinary. And in doing so, we can also acquire the same measure of humility. Good Shabbos to all.